At my wedding reception, my grandmother slipped a crumbling leather passbook into my hands. My father snatched it away, laughed loudly in front of all my guests, and told me to throw the worthless trash away. I smiled, kept the book, and walked into a private bank on Monday morning. The teller typed the account number, froze, and slammed the panic button under her desk. When the branch manager rushed out, he cleared the lobby and whispered, "Mom, you are the rightful heir." Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed my toxic family empire with that single little book, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off relatives who treated you like a second-class citizen. I am Natalie, 35 years old, and I work as an independent estate archivist. I spend my days meticulously organizing and preserving the legacies, historical documents, and family histories of wealthy clients. I crawl through dusty attics, digitize 100-year-old letters, and piece together the truths of generations past. I make sure that people are remembered exactly as they were. Ironically, my own family history was something I spent most of my life trying to escape. My father, Richard, built a sprawling real estate empire that consumed his entire identity. He valued square footage over character and profit margins over people. I was the quiet daughter who chose history over business, so to him I was essentially invisible. My wedding day to Connor was supposed to be the one day that was entirely about us. We paid for almost everything ourselves. The venue was a beautiful rustic conservatory filled with natural light and wildflowers. Connor looked incredibly handsome in his navy suit, and as we stood together waiting to cut our modest two-tier wedding cake, I actually let myself believe that for once I could just be happy. Then I heard the distinct sound of a fork clinking loudly against a crystal glass. The chatter in the room died down. I turned to see my father standing near the head table. His face was flushed red, a sure sign that he had been enjoying the premium scotch from the open bar we paid for. He gripped the microphone with one hand and straightened his expensive designer tie with the other. My stomach immediately twisted into a tight knot. Connor squeezed my hand. We both knew my father. We knew he could not stand not being the center of attention. I braced myself for a passive-aggressive toast about how I finally managed to settle down, or a backhanded compliment about the venue being quaint. But what he did was so much worse. Richard started by thanking everyone for coming to this little get-together. Not a wedding, a little get-together. Then he cleared his throat and his eyes scanned the crowd, completely bypassing me and Connor in our wedding attire. He locked eyes with the VIP table. "You know," Richard boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing off the glass walls, "days like this make a man reflect on his legacy. When I look at my family, I see success. I see drive. I see people who know how to conquer the world." Stephanie Jamal, stand up for a second. My younger sister Stephanie, wearing a white silk dress that looked dangerously close to a wedding gown, stood up with a practiced, radiant smile. Beside her stood her husband, Jamal. Jamal is a brilliant African-American corporate attorney, the kind of guy who wears custom-tailored suits to casual family barbecues and always makes sure you know how much money he makes. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, looking incredibly pleased with himself. My father beamed at them like they were the ones who had just exchanged vows. "Everybody raise your glasses," Richard shouted. Jamal just closed the biggest corporate merger in the history of his firm this morning. $100 million deal. My youngest daughter and my brilliant son-in-law, the true pride of this family. Let us hear it for the real power couple. The room fell dead silent. A few confused guests politely clapped, but most people just shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I stood there with the silver cake knife in my hand, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. My own father had just hijacked my wedding reception to throw a victory party for his golden child and her arrogant husband. Jamal raised his glass of champagne, soaking in the applause that was meant for me and Connor. He did not even have the decency to look embarrassed. In fact, he looked over at me, offered a patronizing little nod, and mouthed the words, "Congratulations to you two." Jamal had always treated me like a naive child who did not understand the real world. He respected power and money above all else, and since I had neither in his eyes, I was barely worth speaking to. Stephanie was blowing kisses to our relatives, acting as if she had just won an award. It was classic Stephanie. Growing up, if I got a perfect report card, she would suddenly develop a mysterious illness that required my parents' undivided attention and a shopping spree to cure. If I won a debate tournament, my father would schedule a family dinner to celebrate Stephanie making the junior varsity cheer squad on the exact same night. But doing it at my wedding, that was a new low, even for them. Richard was not done. He paced back and forth with the microphone, clearly loving the sound of his own voice. He started bragging about the new beachfront property he was developing, making sure everyone in the room knew exactly how much money he was moving around. He talked about his real estate empire, about how he built everything from the ground up with his bare hands. It was the same tired speech he gave at every holiday and every family gathering. I glanced at Connor. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He leaned in and whispered in my ear, asking if I wanted him to go over there and pull the plug on the sound system. I shook my head gently. Giving them a reaction was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to cause a scene so they could paint me as the crazy, ungrateful daughter who ruined her own wedding. I was not going to give them the satisfaction, so I just stood there maintaining a calm, frozen smile. The photographer, a sweet girl we hired from the local arts college, looked absolutely mortified. She lowered her camera, unsure if she should be capturing this train wreck. I gave her a small nod to just take a break. Richard finally wrapped up his unsolicited keynote speech by raising his glass once more. To massive success, he declared loudly, and to my beautiful daughter Stephanie, who reminds me every day what winning looks like. Oh, and cheers to Natalie and Connor too. Enjoy the cake, everyone. He handed the microphone back to the DJ, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The music slowly faded back in, but the festive energy of the room was completely shattered. It felt like a corporate networking event where the host had just insulted half the guests. I took a deep breath, trying to push the heavy knot of humiliation down into my stomach. I had spent my entire life preserving the beautiful histories of other families, while mine constantly erased me. But little did I know the real legacy of this family was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, waiting to hand me the ultimate revenge. Connor pulled me gently toward the center of the room, signaling the DJ to play our song. I just wanted to rest my head against his chest and sway to the music, pretending the last 5 minutes had not happened. The opening acoustic guitar chords filled the conservatory. We took exactly 2 steps together before the music abruptly screeched to a halt. I spun around. My father was standing right next to the DJ booth, waving his hands wildly. Hold on, cut the track!" Richard shouted, his voice booming without the microphone. I forgot the most important part of my toast. You really thought I was going to let everyone just eat cake and go home without acknowledging the elephant in the room? He walked straight onto the polished wood of the dance floor, inserting himself directly between Connor and me. The lingering awkwardness in the room mutated into genuine tension. My mother sat at her table sipping her wine, looking completely unbothered by her husband's behavior. She always enabled him, viewing his cruelty as just a quirky side effect of his brilliant business mind. Richard looked at Connor and gave a condescending chuckle. Look, I know this whole rustic barn aesthetic is very trendy right now. Very down to earth. Very you. But let us be honest with all our friends here. When Natalie came to me with the invoice for this little party, I had to laugh. I told my accountant to just pull some pocket change from our petty cash fund to cover this budget wedding. I mean, somebody had to step up, right? We all know my oldest daughter spends her days digging through dusty old boxes for minimum wage. He turned to the crowd, acting like he was doing a stand-up comedy routine. Seriously, folks, she calls herself an estate archivist. It is a very cute hobby. Really, it is. But let us not pretend it actually pays the bills. If it were not for my real estate company keeping this family afloat, I do not know where she would be. Probably still living in her childhood bedroom hoarding old newspapers. My face burned so intensely I thought my skin might peel off. The sheer audacity to stand at my wedding, which Connor and I had scraped our savings together to pay for, mostly by ourselves, and claim he funded it out of pity, was staggering. He had contributed exactly $1,000 towards my dress and held it over my head for 6 months. He called it an investment in his public relations. Meanwhile, he had bought Stephanie a penthouse condo downtown for her college graduation without blinking an eye. He constantly funded her extravagant lifestyle while treating me like a financial burden who was draining his resources. Connor took a step forward, his fists clenched tight at his sides. I grabbed his arm, digging my nails into his suit jacket, holding him back. If Connor threw a punch, my father would play the victim forever, and I would be the hysterical daughter who ruined everything. I forced myself to stand perfectly still, breathing through my nose. But Richard was not finished. He turned away from me entirely, as if I had ceased to exist on my own dance floor. He looked over at Stephanie, who was still standing by her table with Jamal. Anyway, Richard continued, his voice dripping with affection that I had never once experienced. Talking about my company reminds me of why we do all this hard work. We do it to reward excellence. We do it to support the people who truly elevate the family name. Stephanie, honey, come up here for a second. Stephanie practically glided onto the dance floor, her white silk dress catching the light. She looked like a runway model, completely at ease being the center of attention. Jamal followed close behind her, sliding his hands into the pockets of his custom suit, looking incredibly smug. You know, Richard said, placing a heavy hand on Stephanie's shoulder, you and Jamal have been working so hard lately. This merger Jamal just pulled off is going to put our family in a whole new tax bracket. And Stephanie, your charity gala last month was the talk of the town. You two are the face of the next generation. You carry the image of this family with absolute perfection. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, and maintaining that kind of elite image requires the right tools. I was going to save this for Christmas, but frankly, today just felt like a good day to celebrate real success. Richard pulled out a small, sleek, black leather box. He flipped it open and pulled out a shiny silver key fob bearing the unmistakable golden crest of a Porsche. He held the keys up high so everyone in the room could see them. A brand new Porsche Cayenne is parked in the valet lot out front right now, waiting for you, sweetheart. Fully loaded midnight blue, just like you wanted. Consider it a random Tuesday gift for being such an incredible daughter. Stephanie gasped dramatically, throwing her arms around our father's neck. Oh my God, Dad, you are amazing, she squealed, pressing dramatic kisses to his cheek. Jamal chuckled, clapping Richard on the back like they were fraternity brothers. The crowd was dead silent. There was no polite applause this time, no awkward chuckles, just a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums. My own father had stopped my first dance at my wedding to give my younger sister a luxury sports car just to prove a point. He wanted to visually and financially demonstrate my exact worth in the family hierarchy right in front of all my friends and in-laws. I was the budget wedding. She was the brand new Porsche. I looked around the room. My friends from college looked horrified. Connor's parents sitting at table 4 looked absolutely disgusted. Even some of my father's wealthy business partners looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and refusing to make eye contact with me. Stephanie finally pulled away from Richard and turned to look at me. She twirled the Porsche keys around her perfectly manicured finger, the silver metal catching the chandelier light. She walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. She tilted her head, giving me a pouty, sympathetic look that made my blood boil. "Oh, Nat, do not be mad," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Dad just knows Jamal and I have an image to maintain. You know how the corporate world is. We have to look the part. And your little vintage lifestyle is so cute for you, but it just would not work for us. You understand, right?" I stared at her perfectly glossed lips and the shiny silver keys dangling from her fingers. I felt a sudden wave of sheer exhaustion wash over me, completely replacing my anger. I did not want to scream. I did not want to fight for my dignity in front of an audience that had clearly already chosen their sides. I gave Stephanie a flat, emotionless smile. "Enjoy the car, Stephanie," I said quietly. "Drive safe." Before she could hit me with another condescending remark, I felt a gentle tug on the lace trim of my wedding dress. I looked down and saw my grandmother Beatrice sitting quietly in her wheelchair at a dimly lit corner table. She had been pushed to the side, literally and figuratively positioned near the kitchen doors, where the waitstaff constantly brushed past her. My father's mother was 82 years old, a woman who had survived the loss of her husband and the slow, agonizing theft of her independence. Richard had been trying to force her into a state-run nursing care facility for the past 3 years, claiming her mind was rapidly deteriorating. He controlled her medical proxies and treated her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. But right now, as she looked up at me, her pale blue eyes were sharper and more lucid than I had seen them in a very long time. She gestured with a crooked finger for me to lean down. I knelt beside her wheelchair on the hardwood floor, the expensive layers of my dress spilling out around me. Connor immediately knelt right beside me, placing a warm, protective hand on the small of my back. Grandma Beatrice reached into her worn vintage handbag resting on her lap. Her frail, blue-veined hands were trembling slightly as she pulled out a small object. She reached forward and pressed it firmly into my palms, wrapping her cold fingers over mine to ensure I held on to it. It felt rough and incredibly brittle. I looked down and saw an old, crumbling, leather-bound bank passbook. The edges were heavily frayed, and the gold foil lettering on the front cover had long since rubbed away from decades of handling. "Keep this safe, Natalie," she whispered, her voice barely a dry rasp against the background music. "It is time." I started to ask her what she meant, but before I could even pop the stiff cover open, a heavy hand clamped down violently on my shoulder. My father stood towering over us, his face still flushed with alcohol and misplaced triumph. He reached down and snatched the passbook right out of my hands with brutal force. "What do we have here?" Richard boomed. He did not even bother to use the microphone this time. His natural overbearing volume was loud enough to command the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. "Let us see what the esteemed matriarch has bestowed upon the blushing budget bride." He flipped open the stiff leather cover with a loud crack. He thumbed aggressively through the pages, a cruel, mocking smirk spreading across his face. He let out a harsh, theatrical bark of laughter that echoed loudly off the glass ceiling of the conservatory. "A bank book," Richard said, shaking his head in mock pity. He held the little book up high in the air exactly like he had held Stephanie's Porsche keys just moments before displaying it for the VIP tables to see. A dead savings account from 1995. Not a single printed transaction in over 2 decades. The pages are completely blank. He tossed the book carelessly onto the table next to my grandmother's untouched plate of food. He leaned down, placing both of his large hands heavily on the armrests of her wheelchair, invading her personal space to assert his dominance. "Mom, you really need to let the nurses check your medication levels again," he said loudly, making sure his wealthy business partners could hear his feigned concern. "You are living in the past." Then he turned his cold gaze back to me. The fake fatherly warmth he had displayed during his speech was completely gone, replaced by pure contempt. "Throw it in the trash, Nat. It is completely worthless, just like your grandmother's memory. Come to my corporate office next week, and I will have my accountant cut you a check for a couple $100 so you do not feel completely left out today." I saw a brief flash of profound hurt cross Grandma Beatrice's weathered face before she quickly masked it with a stony, unreadable expression. Seeing him humiliate an old woman in a wheelchair, his own mother, was the final straw. Something inside me finally snapped. But it was not loud. It was not explosive or hysterical, which is exactly what he wanted. It was a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I did not cry. I did not yell. I calmly stood up, reached over my father's arm, and picked the worn leather book up off the table. I brushed a small breadcrumb off the ancient cover. I unclasped my white bridle clutch, slid the passbook securely inside, and snapped the gold clasp shut with a sharp, decisive click. I looked my father dead in the eye, refusing to shrink under his intimidating stature. "Thank you for coming to my little get-together, Richard," I said, my voice completely steady and deadpan. "But Connor and I have a honeymoon flight to catch." I turned my back on him. I knelt down one more time and hugged my grandmother tightly, smelling the familiar scent of lavender powder. When I pulled away, I locked eyes with her. Through the wrinkles and the physical frailty, I saw a fierce, burning intelligence staring back at me. She gave me a single microscopic nod, a silent, unbreakable confirmation between the two of us. Connor stood up tall, offering me his arm. We turned and walked straight toward the main exit of the conservatory. The crowd parted for us in absolute silence. No one threw celebratory confetti. No one clapped or cheered. They just stared, watching the bride and groom leave their own reception in quiet defiance. As we reached the grand double doors leading out to the valet parking lot, Jamal stepped directly into our path, blocking the exit. He had one hand casually tucked into his expensive tailored trousers, the other holding a fresh glass of premium champagne. "Leaving so soon?" Jamal sneered, looking Connor up and down with blatant, unfiltered disgust. "Listen, man, I know tonight was a little rough on the ego. Getting upstaged is tough. But if you are tired of struggling on a blue-collar budget, let me know. I can probably talk to the human resources department at my law firm and get you a job working in the mailroom. It comes with basic dental benefits, which I am sure you two desperately need right now." Connor tightened his grip on my arm, his jaw flexing visibly under his skin. But instead of taking the bait, he just smiled at Jamal. It was a genuinely relaxed, pitying smile that seemed to deeply confuse my arrogant brother-in-law. "No thanks," Jamal Connor replied smoothly, his voice devoid of any intimidation. "I think we are going to be just fine." I smiled tightly, clutching my bag securely against my side. I stepped past Jamal without another word, walking out through the doors and into the crisp, cool night air. I took a deep breath, finally free from the suffocating atmosphere of my family's toxic theater. I did not know it yet as I sat in the back of our modest rental car driving away from my ruined wedding. But that little leather book resting quietly in my clutch was not a dead savings account. It was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. Connor and I were supposed to be packing for our honeymoon. We had booked a modest week-long stay at a quiet bed and breakfast upstate, and our flight was leaving in just 3 days. But when Monday morning rolled around, I could not focus on packing a single suitcase. My mind was entirely consumed by the crumbling piece of leather sitting on my nightstand. I woke up at 6 in the morning, brewed a strong pot of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, just staring at the passbook. As an estate archivist, I handle decaying artifacts, family Bibles, and forgotten legal documents all the time. I know how to read the history of an object just by touching it. The paper inside the book was mid-century high-rag content, which explained why it had survived so well despite being neglected. But the leather cover was suffering from dry rot, indicating it had been hidden somewhere with poor climate control, probably a safe deposit box or a forgotten floorboard. The faint embossed logo on the front belonged to a highly exclusive private banking firm located right in the center of the downtown financial district. I kissed Connor on the forehead while he was still sleeping, carefully placed Grandma Beatrice's passbook into my sturdy leather tote bag, and drove downtown. The private bank was the kind of financial institution that did not bother with flashy outdoor advertising or standard cash machines. The building was wrapped in heavy gray stone and thick tinted glass, projecting an aura of intimidating old money. Walking through the heavy brass double doors felt like entering a silent mausoleum for the ultra-wealthy. The floors were pristine imported marble and the air smelled faintly of expensive cedar and lemon polish. I walked up to the main reception desk. The teller, a woman with a sharply tailored navy blazer and a perfectly stiff blonde updo, looked me up and down. Her eyes quickly catalogued my practical wool cardigan, my sensible walking flats, and my canvas tote bag. Her expression immediately settled into a mask of polite condescension. She clearly decided I was either lost or walking in to ask for directions to a public subway station. How can I assist you today, Mom? She asked, her tone dripping with forced patience. I reached into my bag and gently placed the brittle leather passbook onto the polished marble counter. I would like to check the status of this account, I said, keeping my voice low and even. My grandmother gave it to me this weekend, and I need to know if it is still active. The teller let out a soft, barely audible sigh. She reached out and grabbed the book carelessly, her long manicured nails scraping against the fragile, decaying leather. I instinctively winced. She flipped it open to the first blank page, looking at the handwritten alphanumeric account number stamped at the top. Mom, we do not typically handle vintage savings bonds or petty cash redemptions at this branch, she said, sliding the book back toward me, just a fraction of an inch. You might have better luck taking this to a standard retail bank. They can look up the archival records for closed accounts from the 90s. My grandmother specifically told me to bring it here. I insisted, pushing the book firmly back across the marble. Just type in the number, please. She gave me a tight, patronizing smile, clearly annoyed that I was wasting her valuable time. Fine, she murmured, tapping her perfectly manicured fingers across her mechanical keyboard. Let me just pull up the archive database. I stood there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. I watched her eyes tracking the screen. She typed in the long string of faded numbers, hit the enter key, and waited. The computer system let out a sharp metallic error chime. The teller frowned. She backspaced. The entry muttered something under her breath about outdated routing formats and typed the numbers in a second time, much slower. She hit enter again. This time there was no error chime. Instead, her entire computer monitor flashed a brilliant, glaring red. The reflection of the screen illuminated her pale face. The ambient background noise of the quiet bank suddenly seemed to completely vanish, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. The teller stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen in place. She stared at the screen, and I watched the color rapidly drain from her cheeks, leaving her looking physically ill. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. Is there a problem? I asked, my voice suddenly feeling very small in the massive, cavernous room. She did not answer me right away. Her eyes darted frantically from the glowing red screen down to the crumbling leather book on the counter, and then finally up to my face. The polite condescension was completely gone, replaced by absolute wide-eyed panic. Please wait right here for just one moment, ma'am, she stammered, her voice shaking so badly it cracked on the last word. Before I could ask her what was wrong, she slowly lowered her right hand beneath the heavy marble counter. I heard the faint but distinct mechanical click of a button being depressed. A silent alarm. A sudden chill shot straight down my spine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The two heavily built armed security guards standing near the front entrance suddenly stood up straighter, adjusting the utility belts at their waists. They exchanged a rapid, intense glance and immediately began walking across the marble lobby, positioning themselves strategically behind me. They did not draw their weapons, but their hands rested firmly on their holsters, and their eyes were locked dead on my back. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Panic flooded my chest. Richard, my father, had beaten me to it. He must have called the police or the bank directors on Sunday right after the wedding and reported the passbook stolen. He had the money, the connections, and the vicious, vindictive streak required to do exactly that. He knew Grandma Beatrice had given it to me, but he would happily lie to the authorities and claim I manipulated a confused old woman into handing over stolen property. I was going to be arrested. I was standing in a high-end financial institution, about to be detained for grand larceny right before my honeymoon. I clutched the strap of my tote bag, my palms sweating profusely, calculating whether I should try to explain the situation to the guards or immediately demand a lawyer. The teller scrambled backward off her stool, nearly tripping over her own heels as she abandoned her station entirely. She practically sprinted toward a heavy frosted glass door at the back of the lobby, leaving the passbook sitting completely unguarded on the counter between us. I took a shallow, shaky breath, feeling the heavy presence of the two armed guards standing just inches behind my shoulders. The heavy, frosted glass door swung open, and I braced myself for the worst. The heavy, frosted glass door swung violently open. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting to see uniformed police officers charging into the lobby with handcuffs. Instead, a tall older man in a charcoal three-piece suit practically sprinted out from the back offices. He was clutching a tablet to his chest and visibly sweating. His face was completely flushed, and he was breathing heavily as if he had just run up 6 flights of stairs. He saw the security guard standing behind me and immediately waved his hands in the air. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice echoing sharply across the marble floors. "Both of you return to your posts right now." The guards immediately relaxed, dropping their hands from their utility belts and backing away. The man hurried around the counter, completely ignoring the terrified teller who was cowering near the copy machine. He stopped about 3 feet in front of me and quickly straightened his tie, trying to regain some semblance of professional composure. He looked down at the crumbling leather passbook sitting on the counter, and his eyes widened in absolute shock. He stared at it like it was a holy relic. "Please accept my most profound apologies, Mrs. Brooks," he said, using my married name, which meant he had already pulled my profile from the system. "I am Thomas Harrison, the Senior Branch Manager. The system lock you triggered is a Tier 1 security protocol. It is only activated for our most sensitive legacy accounts." He gestured toward the back hallway with a trembling hand. "If you would please do me the honor of accompanying me to our private client vault. We have a great deal to discuss, and it is imperative that we do so behind closed doors." I followed him through the frosted glass door, leaving the bewildered teller and the security guards behind. We walked down a long, quiet hallway lined with dark oak paneling and antique oil paintings. Mr. Harrison unlocked a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a submarine, leading us into a soundproof, windowless conference room. The room was aggressively luxurious, featuring a massive polished mahogany table and high-back leather chairs. "Please have a seat," he said, pulling a chair out for me. He walked over to a built-in wall safe, pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, and retrieved a pair of white cotton archival gloves. He slipped them on before walking back to the table. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the passbook I was holding. I placed the brittle leather book on the mahogany surface. He treated it with more care than I had seen my father treat his own family. He gently opened the cover and traced the faded serial numbers on the first page. "I do not understand," I said, finally breaking the heavy silence. "The teller said the account was dead. My father said it was completely worthless. He told me to throw it in the trash at my wedding reception." Mr. Harrison stopped tracing the numbers and looked up at me. His expression was a mixture of deep professional respect and genuine astonishment. "Mom, you are the rightful heir," he said quietly. "This is not a savings account, and it is certainly not worthless." He walked over to a secure filing cabinet and pulled out a massive leather-bound portfolio, dropping it onto the table in front of me. The sheer weight of the documents made a solid thud. "What you are looking at is a bearer bond ledger," he explained, tapping the crumbling passbook. "It is an instrument of finance that is almost entirely extinct in modern banking. A bearer instrument means that whoever physically holds this book in their hands is the absolute legal owner of the assets attached to it. There are no secondary names on the account. There is no digital backup that can override it. Possession is quite literally the only law that applies." I stared at the blank yellowed pages. But what assets, I asked, my heart starting to race again. "My grandmother Beatrice has been living on a fixed pension for 20 years. My father pays for her assisted living facility." Mr. Harrison shook his head, a faint grim smile touching his lips. "Your father pays for nothing," he corrected gently. He opened the thick portfolio and turned to the first page, sliding it toward me. I looked down at the paper. It was a corporate registration document from 4 decades ago. "This ledger is linked to an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust established in 1982, he continued. "Your grandmother Beatrice was not just a housewife, she was the silent original funder of your father's entire real estate empire. When Richard wanted to start his development firm, he was rejected by every major bank in the city. He had no capital and terrible credit. Your grandmother used her own inherited family wealth to stake his first 5 construction projects. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. My father had spent his entire life bragging that he was a self-made man. He claimed he built his empire from the ground up with his bare hands, while treating his mother like an incompetent burden. But she was not foolish enough to just hand him the money, Mr. Harrison said, tapping the corporate charter. She structured the investment through this blind trust. She allowed Richard to operate as the chief executive officer and the public face of the company. She let him take all the credit and live the lavish billionaire lifestyle. But she quietly maintained the controlling interest. He pointed to a specific paragraph highlighted in the dense legal text. This passbook holds 51% of the voting shares for the entire corporate conglomerate. Every skyscraper, every commercial warehouse, every beachfront development your father claims to own belongs primarily to this trust. Richard never actually owned his company. He is just a glorified employee. And because you now hold the bearer ledger, you are his boss. The room started to spin. I grabbed the edge of the mahogany table to steady myself. The mansion, the private jets, the brand new Porsche he had just bought for Stephanie to humiliate me. All of it was funded by a company that belonged to the woman sitting quietly in a wheelchair in the corner of my wedding venue. The woman my father publicly ridiculed and threatened to institutionalize. Mr. Harrison flipped to another section of the portfolio, revealing dozens of formal legal complaints, letters of demand, and aggressive corporate injunctions. I immediately recognized the letterhead on several of the documents. They were from Jamal's prestigious law firm. Jamal had been using his corporate legal team to wage a secret war against the bank on my father's behalf. Your father has been desperately trying to liquidate this trust and seize total control of the assets for the past 5 years, Mr. Harrison explained, his tone growing dark. He has sent his lawyers here repeatedly. He has threatened to sue us into the ground. He even tried to claim that the ledger was destroyed in a house fire to force a mandatory asset release. So why did he not just take the money, I asked, feeling a surge of protective anger for my grandmother. Because our bank charter is legally impenetrable, Mr. Harrison replied, leaning back in his chair. We require the physical presentation of the bearer book to authorize any changes to the trust structure. Your father turned your grandmother's house upside down looking for it before he forced her into that facility. He tore up the floorboards. He drilled open her personal safes. He hired private investigators. But she had clearly hidden it somewhere he could never reach. She hid it inside the lining of an old winter coat, I realized out loud, piecing together the memory of her asking me to bring her a specific jacket from storage last winter. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew Richard was tearing the house apart, so she kept it sewn inside a coat she wore every single day. Mr. Harrison nodded solemnly. Your grandmother knew her mind was beginning to fail her. She knew that if Richard got his hands on this book, he would dissolve the trust, cut her off entirely, and likely disinherit you completely in favor of your younger sister. By handing this ledger to you in front of witnesses at a major family event, she executed a perfectly legal transfer of ultimate corporate authority. He pushed the heavy portfolio entirely across the table until it rested right against my hands. I looked down at the dense stacks of financial statements, property deeds, and offshore account balances. The numbers printed on those pages were staggering. It was not just millions, it was hundreds of millions. My father had spent 35 years making me feel completely worthless. He had mocked my career, undermined my confidence, and turned my wedding day into a stage to worship his golden child. He had handed Stephanie the keys to a luxury sports car and told me to throw this rotting piece of leather in the trash. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the crumbling cover of the passbook. The sheer terror that had gripped me out in the lobby was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, powerful surge of pure adrenaline. I did not just have a little bit of leverage over my toxic family. I had the nuclear codes. I now owned my father's entire life. Mr. Harrison noticed my shock, but he was not finished. He reached into the back of the massive portfolio and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. The hits just kept coming. He slid a stack of photocopied medical documents across the polished mahogany table. I looked down and saw my grandmother's name printed at the top of a psychiatric evaluation form. The paperwork was dated just 3 weeks ago. My father did not just want the money, Mr. Harrison said, his voice tightening with professional disgust. He wanted to ensure your grandmother could never legally challenge him. These are copies of competency evaluations your father submitted to our legal department. He hired a private physician to declare Beatrice severely impaired by dementia. He applied for absolute medical and financial power of attorney. He was trying to completely erase her legal autonomy. I felt physically sick. My father had stood at my wedding and joked about his own mother's memory slipping, but behind closed doors, he was actively trying to strip away her basic human rights. He wanted to lock her in a state facility and throw away the key, all so he could drain the trust she had built. But it did not work, I said, looking up at Mr. Harrison. No, it did not, he confirmed, tapping the corporate charter. Because your grandmother was a brilliant woman. When she established this blind trust, she included a highly specific fail-safe provision. No power of attorney, no medical proxy, and no outside legal decree can override the trust without the physical presentation of the bearer bond ledger. Your father had the forged medical documents, but because he could not produce the little leather book you are holding, our legal department rejected his claim entirely. He has been backed into a corner ever since. While I was absorbing the terrifying reality that my own father was an active criminal, my cell phone suddenly started vibrating violently against the wooden table. The sudden buzzing sound made us both jump. I looked down at the screen. The caller ID displayed Jamal's name. Jamal never called me. In the 5 years he had been dating and then married to my sister Stephanie, I could count the number of times we had spoken on the phone on one hand. He usually communicated with me through Stephanie or just ignored my existence entirely. I picked up the phone and swiped the green answer button, holding it to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Listen, Nat, Jamal barked, his voice sharp and incredibly impatient. The background noise of his high-end downtown law firm echoed through the receiver. I could hear paralegals talking and phones ringing. I do not have time for games today. You need to get down to my office right now. I kept my voice perfectly flat. Excuse me, I asked. Your grandmother made a complete mess this weekend with that old bank book. He sighed loudly, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow intern who had just spilled coffee on his shoes. Richard is losing his mind over it. He is threatening to cut off the wedding vendor payments because of the little stunt you pulled walking out early. I told him I would handle it. Get here immediately so we can clean up Beatrice's mess. Jamal had absolutely no idea. He thought the passbook was exactly what my father said it was, an expired, worthless relic. He thought I was just holding on to it to be stubborn. And because Jamal was a fiercely arrogant corporate lawyer, he assumed he could just snap his fingers and intimidate me into compliance. I am actually a bit busy this morning, Jamal, I replied, keeping my tone deceptively mild. Connor and I have a honeymoon to pack for. I do not care about your budget vacation, Nat. He snapped, his patience completely evaporating. This is not a request. Your father is my biggest client and his business is currently restructuring. We need to clear out all the old family liabilities today. If you do not bring that book to my office in the next 20 minutes, I am going to have my associates draft a formal injunction against you for withholding family property. Do not make this harder than it has to be. He hung up the phone without waiting for a response. The line went dead with a sharp click. I slowly lowered the phone to the table. For my entire life, I had let people like Jamal and Richard dictate my every move. I had shrunk myself down to avoid their anger. I had smiled politely while they insulted my husband, my career, and my self-worth. But the woman who had walked into this bank 30 minutes ago was not the same woman sitting in the leather chair right now. Is everything all right, Mrs. Brooks? Mr. Harrison asked, leaning forward with a look of genuine concern. Everything is perfectly fine, Mr. Harrison, I said. In fact, things have never been clearer. I stood up and picked up the crumbling leather passbook, carefully sliding it into the secure inside pocket of my canvas tote bag. I looked down at the massive portfolio of corporate documents, the undeniable proof of my father's lies, and Jamal's aggressive legal manipulation. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice steady and commanding, "I need you to print me 5 years of transaction histories for the entire trust. Every single withdrawal, every single wire transfer, every corporate expense my father has authorized. I want it all on paper." Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my sudden shift in demeanor. "That is going to be a substantial amount of paperwork, ma'am. It might take a few minutes to authorize and print." "I have the time," I replied, crossing my arms. "And while you are doing that, please prepare whatever formal paperwork I need to sign to legally register myself as the active holder of this ledger. I want my name officially on the record before I leave this building." Mr. Harrison smiled a genuine, respectful smile that completely transformed his face. "It would be my absolute pleasure, Chairwoman Brooks." 10 minutes later, I walked out of the private client vault, carrying a tote bag that was significantly heavier than when I arrived. Inside it was a thick stack of freshly printed financial documents wrapped in a discreet black folder. The papers detailed exactly how Richard had been hemorrhaging money and funneling corporate funds through questionable channels. The terrified teller from earlier watched me walk across the lobby, her eyes wide with lingering panic, but I did not even glance in her direction. The security guards immediately stepped aside to open the heavy brass doors for me. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the bustling noise of the financial district washing over me. Jamal wanted me at his office. He wanted to intimidate me in his expensive glass-walled conference room, surrounded by his framed degrees and his arrogant sense of superiority. He wanted me to hand over the only thing protecting my grandmother from being locked away. I hailed a passing taxi and slid into the back seat. I gave the driver the address for Jamal's prestigious downtown law firm. I rested my hand on my tote bag, feeling the solid weight of the documents inside. I was heading straight into the lion's den, but for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the loaded gun. The taxi pulled up in front of a massive glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, clutching my canvas tote bag tightly against my side. Jamal's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the building. It was the kind of corporate environment designed specifically to make you feel small and insignificant the moment you walked through the revolving doors. I crossed the expansive marble lobby and stepped into the express elevator, watching the floor numbers climb higher and higher. When the elevator doors parted, I stepped out into a reception area that looked like a modern art museum. Everything was sharp angles, cold slate, and polished glass. The receptionist, a young woman wearing a headset and a perfectly tailored suit, barely glanced at me when I gave her my name. She simply pointed toward a long hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling glass conference rooms. I walked down the hallway, my sensible flats completely silent on the thick plush carpet. I spotted them in the largest corner office at the very end of the hall. The walls were entirely transparent, allowing me to observe them before they even noticed I was there. My father Richard was pacing back and forth near the massive windows, looking out over the city skyline. He looked incredibly irritated, repeatedly checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist. Stephanie was sitting at the massive granite conference table, scrolling through her phone. She was wearing designer sunglasses indoors and holding a tiny porcelain espresso cup. They looked like a wealthy family waiting out a minor flight delay, completely unbothered by the fact that they had absolutely ruined my wedding just 2 days prior. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid weight of the black folder inside my bag, and pushed the heavy glass door open. Stephanie looked up from her phone and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, you finally made it," she said, setting her espresso cup down on a leather coaster. "Dad was just about to have his assistant call you again. I was starting to think you got lost on the subway." "I did not take the subway, Stephanie," I said, walking toward the empty side of the table. "And I am exactly on time." Richard turned away from the window and glared at me. His eyes darted to my practical clothing and the canvas bag slung over my shoulder. He let out a familiar, condescending scoff. "Well, it is about time, Natalie," He snapped his voice, carrying that same booming authority he used to humiliate me on the dance floor. I have a dozen contractors waiting on me at a job site right now. I do not have all morning to sit around dealing with this nonsense. Have a seat so we can get this over with. He did not offer a single apology for the wedding. He did not ask how my weekend was or how Connor was doing. To him, I was just a minor administrative hurdle standing in the way of his schedule. I pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat down, placing my tote bag carefully on the floor right next to my feet. I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to shrink under his gaze. A door at the back of the conference room opened, and Jamal walked in. He was holding a sleek leather folder and looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was wearing another custom-tailored suit, this one a sharp charcoal gray, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He walked over to the head of the granite table and took his seat, projecting the aura of a man who was absolutely in control of the universe. He did not offer me coffee or water. He did not offer a polite greeting. He just opened his folder and began pulling out stacks of thick, legally dense documents, slapping them onto the stone surface. "Let us skip the small talk," Jamal said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "We are all busy people. I brought you down here because we have a minor housekeeping issue to resolve regarding your grandmother." I kept my face perfectly blank, resting my hands on the cool granite surface of the table. "A housekeeping issue," I repeated softly. Jamal nodded, completely missing the dangerous edge in my voice. He spread the papers out in front of me, aligning the edges with practiced precision. "As you know, your dad is expanding the commercial side of his real estate firm. We are bringing in some heavy investors for a new waterfront development. But to secure the financing, we need to clean up some of the legacy assets on the corporate books." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. He adopted a tone that was falsely patient, like a teacher explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. It was the exact same tone he used when he offered Connor a job in the mailroom. "Years ago, your grandmother Beatrice was listed as a passive beneficiary on some of the early foundational accounts," Jamal explained smoothly, lying directly to my face without blinking. "It was just a tax strategy back in the 80s. But now that she is older and unfortunately losing her mental faculties, having her name attached to the corporate structure is causing some compliance issues with the new investors." Richard stepped up to the table, standing right behind Jamal's chair. "Exactly," he interjected loudly, pounding his fist lightly on the leather chair back. "The bank auditors are being completely ridiculous about it. They want a mountain of paperwork just to move my own money around. It is a total nightmare for my accounting department." Stephanie rolled her eyes and picked up her phone again, completely disengaged from the conversation. "It is so embarrassing," she complained, not even looking at me. "Jamal had to spend his entire weekend dealing with this, just because Grandma is too confused to sign a simple document." I sat there quietly looking at the three of them. They were so incredibly confident in their deception. They truly believed I was ignorant enough to swallow this ridiculous, fabricated story. They thought I was the same quiet, submissive girl who would just nod and do whatever she was told to keep the peace. They had absolutely no idea that I had just spent the last hour sitting in a private bank vault, reviewing decades of financial records that proved Richard was nothing more than an employee of an irrevocable blind trust. I knew about the forged medical documents. I knew about the offshore accounts. I knew exactly why they were panicking. "So what exactly do you need from me, Jamal?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Jamal slid the thickest stack of legal papers directly across the table until it rested right in front of me. He picked up an expensive silver pen from his desk set and placed it deliberately on top of the final signature page. "Your dad's company needs some routine restructuring." Jamal lies smoothly. "Just sign this standard family waiver relinquishing any claim to Grandma's estate. It is just formalities to save your father's business." I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting on the cold granite table. The top page had the word waiver printed in bold letters at the very top. Jamal pushed the expensive silver pen an inch closer to my hand, expecting me to just blindly scribble my name and leave. But my entire career as an archivist was built on reading the fine print. I spend my days deciphering century-old legal jargon, estate declarations, and hidden clauses. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I picked up the document and started reading the second paragraph. Jamal let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Natalie, we really do not have time for a reading comprehension session today," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing annoyance. "It is standard boilerplate legal text. Just sign on the dotted lines so we can all get back to our actual jobs." I ignored him and kept my eyes on the paper. The further I read, the faster my heart beat, not out of fear but out of pure absolute disgust. This was not a standard family waiver to appease bank auditors. It was a comprehensive, aggressively drafted deed of transfer. "This document explicitly names the bearer bond ledger," I said, my voice dangerously calm in the quiet room. "And it completely surrenders all rights, titles, and interests of that ledger directly into Stephanie's name. It also grants Jamal absolute financial power of attorney over Grandma Beatrice's medical care. You are not restructuring the company. You are trying to legally steal her entire estate and hand it to my sister." The room went completely still for a fraction of a second. Jamal stiffened, his perfectly tailored shoulders tensing. He clearly had not expected the quiet budget bride to actually understand the dense legal trap he had laid out. But before he could try to spin his way out of it, the family gaslighting machine kicked into overdrive. Stephanie dropped her phone onto the table with a loud clatter. She let out a dramatic gasp, pressing her manicured hands to her chest. Her eyes instantly welled up with tears that she could summon on absolute command. "How can you be so paranoid?" Stephanie cried, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "We are trying to protect this family, Natalie. Grandma is sick and Dad is under so much pressure to keep the business afloat. Jamal spent hours drafting this to save us, and you are sitting there accusing him of stealing." She stood up from her chair, pacing tightly near the window, wiping away a single perfectly timed tear. "You are ruining everything," she sobbed. "Do you have any idea what is at stake here? If you do not sign this document, Jamal and I will lose the down payment on our second vacation home in Aspen. We already signed the escrow papers based on this restructuring. If the deal falls through, we lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why are you always so unbelievably selfish?" I stared at her, letting her words hang in the air. I had spent the last 2 years saving every spare dime, clipping coupons, and taking extra archiving contracts just to afford the catering at my modest wedding. A wedding that they had actively tried to ruin. And now my younger sister was standing in a high-rise corporate office crying because my refusal to sign away our grandmother's life savings might cost her a second luxury vacation home in the mountains. The sheer absurdity of it was staggering. "You want me to sign away Grandma's trust fund so you can buy a ski lodge?" I asked flatly, refusing to validate her tears. Richard had heard enough. He slammed both of his large, heavy hands down on the granite table with such explosive force that Stephanie's porcelain espresso cup rattled against its saucer. He loomed over me, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he unleashed the ultimate toxic parent guilt trip. "Do not sit there and question my attorneys in my presence," Richard roared, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "Who do you think you are? You are nothing without me. I built this family from the ground up. I put a roof over your head. I clothed you. I fed you for 18 years. You owe me this." He pointed a thick, accusing finger right at my face. "You chose to waste your life playing with dusty old papers while your sister actually built a legacy. I am the only one protecting your grandmother. I am the only one keeping the lights on. You owe me everything, Natalie. Now pick up that pen and sign the damn paper before I cut you out of this family forever." It was the exact same script he had used my entire life. Whenever I stepped out of line, whenever I showed a singular ounce of independence or asked for basic respect, he would weaponize my basic childhood necessities. He acted as if providing food and shelter for his own child was a massive unpayable debt that I had to carry until the day I died. For 35 years, those words had worked. They had always made me feel small, ungrateful, and guilty. They surrounded me in that cold glass room, Richard towering over me with explosive rage, Stephanie sobbing in the corner playing the ultimate victim, Jamal sitting at the head of the table glaring at me with cold legal authority. They were orchestrating a perfectly synchronized psychological attack designed to break me down. They were waiting for me to fold exactly the way I always did when I was a terrified teenager. They expected me to apologize, to shrink myself, to cry, and to sign my name just to make the screaming stop. I looked down at the fraudulent document. I looked at the expensive silver pen resting on the polished granite. I could feel the heavy canvas tote bag pressing against my leg under the table holding the freshly printed bank records. Records that proved Richard had not built anything from the ground up. Records that proved every single dollar he used to clothe and feed me actually belonged to the woman he was trying to lock away in a psychiatric ward. The heavy, suffocating guilt that usually paralyzed my chest simply vanished. It evaporated completely, leaving behind a crystal-clear, focused anger. I was not that scared little girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old woman. I was a wife. I was a professional archivist who dealt in facts and evidence. And right now, I was the majority shareholder of the very room we were standing in. I slowly reached my hand out across the table. Richard stopped yelling. Stephanie's fake sobs quieted down to a soft, strategic sniffle. Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, victorious smirk creeping onto his face. They all collectively held their breath watching my hand. They thought they had won. They thought the pressure had successfully crushed my spirit. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal barrel of the expensive silver pen. I pulled it toward me. But I did not point the tip at the signature line. Instead of signing my name, I pressed the tip of the pen against the first page of the document. I drew a thick, deliberate circle around the clause naming Jamal as the executor of the transfer. Then I flipped to the second page and circled another paragraph. I flipped to the third and circled a final sentence. "What are you doing?" Jamal demanded, his voice dropping its smooth, professional veneer. "Stop defacing the legal documents." "I am not defacing them," I said calmly, looking up to meet his furious gaze. "I am grading your work, Jamal. And honestly, for a partner at a top-tier corporate firm, I am deeply unimpressed." Jamal stared at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. Under state financial trust laws, any coercion applied to the transfer of an irrevocable bearer bond ledger completely nullifies the transaction, I recited, reciting the exact legal framework I had just studied in the bank vault. Furthermore, a basic family waiver cannot supersede the foundational charter of a blind trust established in 1982 without the physical ledger being authenticated by a licensed fiduciary, which you are not. You are actively attempting to execute a fraudulent asset transfer under the guise of corporate restructuring. The silence in the room was absolute. Stephanie stopped sniffing. Richard froze his mouth slightly open. They looked at me as if I had just suddenly started speaking fluent Russian. "You do not know what you are talking about," Jamal scoffed, attempting to regain control of the room. "You are an archivist, Natalie. Do not pretend you understand high-level corporate finance. Just sign the damn paper." I ignored him and turned my attention directly to my father. "You know Richard?" I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. "When I was at the bank this morning, I assumed the system lock was just a glitch. I had no idea that a Tier 1 security protocol would be activated simply because you submitted forged psychiatric evaluations trying to have your own mother declared legally incompetent." Richard's face went completely white. The anger drained out of him instantly, replaced by sheer raw panic. "How do you know about that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Because Mr. Harrison, the senior branch manager, showed me the rejection letters," I replied, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. "He also showed me the corporate charter. The charter that proves Grandma Beatrice is the majority shareholder of your entire real estate empire." You do not own anything, Richard. You are an employee of the trust. And as of 10 o'clock this morning, I am the legally registered holder of the bearer passbook. Stephanie's phone buzzed loudly on the granite table, but no one looked at it. She stared at her husband, her eyes wide with sudden fear. Jamal? What is she talking about? Stephanie asked, her voice trembling. You said this was just a tax issue. You said Dad owned everything. Shut up, Stephanie. Jamal snapped, his composure finally breaking. He leaned across the table, placing his hands flat on the granite. He dropped the friendly brother-in-law act completely. His eyes were cold and calculating, entirely devoid of any familial warmth. Listen to me very carefully, Natalie. Jamal hissed, his voice low and threatening. I do not care what some bank manager told you. You are completely out of your depth. You are dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars and a corporate structure that is vastly more complicated than some dusty old library records. If you try to claim ownership of that trust, I will personally bury you in so much litigation that you will be bankrupt before the end of the year. I will drag this through probate court for decades. I will make sure you cannot even afford a lawyer to defend yourself. He pointed a finger directly at my face. You are going to hand over that passbook, or I am going to destroy your life, your modest little existence, your budget husband, your entire world will be crushed. Do you understand me? I looked at the three of them. My father, who was sweating profusely, staring at the floor in defeated panic. My sister, who was finally realizing that her luxury lifestyle was built entirely on a foundation of lies. And my arrogant brother-in-law, who thought he could still intimidate me into submission. I smiled. It was a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I understand perfectly, Jamal, I said. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, pushing it back against the glass wall. I reached down and picked up my canvas tote bag, slinging it over my shoulder. I picked up the expensive silver pen from the table and casually tossed it onto his immaculate leather desk blotter. Keep the pen, Jamal, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. You are going to need it to write your resignation letter. I turned my back on them and walked toward the conference room door. Richard suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the back of my chair. Natalie, wait, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. You cannot just leave. We need to talk about this. We are family. I did not stop walking. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the plush, quiet hallway. The receptionist at the front desk looked up in surprise as I strode past her, heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I pressed the call button for the elevator, keeping my eyes locked on the digital floor indicator above the doors. I heard the conference room door slam open down the hall. Richard was shouting Jamal's name, demanding answers. Stephanie was crying hysterically, her voice echoing through the sterile corporate environment. The perfect facade of their wealthy, successful lives was actively crumbling right behind me. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. I stepped inside the empty car and pressed the button for the lobby. As the steel doors began to slowly close, I caught one final glimpse of my father sprinting down the hallway, his face twisted in absolute terror. The doors slid completely shut, cutting him off entirely. The heavy silence of the descending elevator wrapped around me. I leaned back against the mirrored wall, letting out a long, slow exhale. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline crash. I had done it. I had looked the monsters of my childhood directly in the eye and refused to blink. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I opened my messages and pulled up the new contact number Mr. Harrison had given me before I left the bank. My thumbs moved quickly across the screen. Freeze all of Richard's corporate accounts immediately, I typed. Initiate a full forensic audit of the entire trust. I hit send. The message bubbled up onto the screen, turning blue. I slid the phone back into my pocket as the elevator reached the ground floor. I walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, taking a deep breath of the city air. The first domino had officially fallen, and I was ready to watch the rest of them crash to the ground. The freeze went into effect at exactly 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. I knew this because Mr. Harrison, the senior branch manager, had sent me a brief, highly professional email confirming the action. I sat at my modest kitchen table wrapped in my cardigan, watching the clock tick past 8:15, imagining the exact moment my father's carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. Richard always took his most important prospective clients to a ridiculously overpriced downtown country club for breakfast on Tuesdays. He loved to order the imported caviar omelet just to prove he could afford to waste the money. I pictured him sitting there in his custom-tailored suit, confident and booming, as the waiter approached with the leather check folio. He would have casually tossed his heavy metal platinum corporate card onto the silver tray, not even bothering to look at the total. And then the waiter would return. "Sir, the card has been declined." Richard would laugh it off, blame a bank routing error, and hand over his backup black card. Declined. The sheer public humiliation of a man who equated his entire self-worth with his credit limit, being unable to pay for breakfast in front of a wealthy investor, was absolute poetic justice. By 9 o'clock, the financial freeze had completely paralyzed the entire corporate structure. The irrevocable blind trust was the central artery pumping money into every subsidiary account my father and sister used to fund their lavish lifestyles. When Mr. Harrison clamped that artery shut upon my written authorization, everything stopped instantly. I imagined the frantic, chaotic phone calls, Richard screaming at his accounting department from the mahogany lobby of the country club, the accountants discovering they were completely locked out of the primary banking portal and realizing the supposed chief executive officer no longer had the authorization to move a single cent. And then the dominoes rapidly reached Stephanie. She was probably at her exclusive Pilates studio or browsing a high-end designer boutique when her titanium credit card suddenly turned into a useless piece of plastic. She could not buy her morning green juice. She could not pay for her valet parking. The bottomless well of our grandmother's money had finally run dry, and they were all crashing violently back to earth. Stephanie did not handle adversity with grace. When she realized Jamal could not instantly fix the problem with a threatening legal letter, she resorted to her favorite and most dangerous weapon: public manipulation. At 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed loudly with a notification. A cousin had tagged me in a Facebook post. I opened the app and found a video Stephanie had uploaded across all her social media platforms just minutes before. She was sitting in the living room of her sprawling luxury penthouse, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater, looking intentionally small and disheveled. She had positioned the ring light perfectly to capture her tear-stained face and messy bun. She did not look like an arrogant woman who had just been caught trying to steal from an 82-year-old woman. She looked like a terrified, helpless victim. I watched the video in complete disbelief, the volume turned up in the quiet kitchen. Stephanie stared directly into the camera lens, her voice shaking with highly practiced emotion. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she began, wiping a strategic tear from her cheek. "But my family is under attack, and I have to speak up to protect the people I love. As many of you know, my older sister Natalie has always struggled with deep jealousy regarding my success. We tried to include her. We tried to support her budget lifestyle. But this weekend she crossed a line I simply cannot forgive." She paused, taking a ragged, shaky breath for maximum dramatic effect. "Natalie has taken advantage of our grandmother Beatrice, who is currently suffering from severe dementia. She manipulated a confused elderly woman into handing over sensitive banking documents to steal control of our family business. She is freezing my father's accounts, attempting to ruin the company he built from nothing, all out of petty spite. It is textbook elder abuse, and my heart is completely broken." She did not mention the brand new Porsche she received right in the middle of my wedding reception. She did not mention the forged psychiatric evaluations Jamal had illegally submitted to the bank to strip Grandma Beatrice of her human rights. She spun a perfect, devastating narrative that painted me as a greedy, vindictive monster attacking a defenseless patriarch. And our extended family swallowed the lie completely whole. Within an hour, my phone became a toxic wasteland. Text messages flooded in from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not even bothered to RSVP to my wedding. The hypocrisy was staggering. Relatives who had ignored Grandma Beatrice for a decade suddenly appointed themselves as her righteous defenders simply because Stephanie cried on camera. "How could you do this to your own father?" One aunt texted her, words dripping with judgment. "You are absolutely sick, Natalie. Give the money back, you disgusting gold digger," a cousin wrote, adding several angry face emojis. One of my uncles actually left a screaming voicemail threatening to call the authorities and have me arrested for elder financial abuse. He called me a bitter spinster who was just trying to ruin Stephanie's perfect life. My phone vibrated endlessly across the kitchen counter, sounding like an angry swarm of hornets. The sheer volume of raw, unfiltered hatred was suffocating. For my entire life I had tried to be the good, quiet daughter. I had never asked for a dime from Richard. I had worked hard to build my own independent career as an archivist. And yet the moment I stood up for myself and protected my grandmother from their greed, I was instantly branded the ultimate villain. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar heavy weight of family guilt threatening to crush my new resolve. The gaslighting was so intense and coordinated that for a fleeting second, I actually questioned my own sanity. I reached out to pick up the phone, wondering if I should try to defend myself in the comments section, or post pictures of the fraudulent waiver Jamal had tried to force me to sign. I felt the tears burning the back of my eyes, not out of sadness, but out of profound, isolating exhaustion. Before my trembling fingers could touch the glowing screen, a large, warm hand covered mine. Connor gently but firmly pulled the phone away from my grasp. He had been standing behind me, watching the entire video over my shoulder and reading the vile text messages as they rolled in. His expression had hardened into pure, protective fury. He did not yell. He did not. He did not tell me to calm down or try to rationalize their toxic behavior. He just systematically flipped my phone to silent mode, turned the screen off, and placed it face down on the granite counter, severing the connection to their world completely. He walked over to the coffee maker, poured a fresh steaming cup of dark roast, and set it gently in front of me. Then he leaned down, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders and pressing a solid, grounding kiss to the top of my head. "Let them talk," Connor said, his voice a low, steady rumble of absolute certainty. "Let them post their little fake crying videos and send their hateful messages. Drink your coffee, Nat. Let them talk. Because we are about to roar." Connor did not just offer me empty comfort and a cup of coffee. He immediately walked over to his work bag, pulled out his laptop, and set it down on the kitchen island right next to my silenced phone. For 35 years, I had been trained to absorb my family's abuse in absolute silence, but Connor refused to let me fight this battle alone. He opened a search engine and started pulling up legal directories. "We are not just going to sit here and let them control the narrative," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Your father and Jamal think they can bully you because they have money and expensive suits. But they forgot one massive detail, Natalie. You hold the passbook now. That means you hold the purse strings to their entire operation. We are going to hire a shark." I pulled the heavy black folder Mr. Harrison had given me out of my tote bag. I looked at the corporate charter for the irrevocable blind trust. Connor was right. Section 4 of the charter explicitly stated that the majority shareholder had access to an unlimited legal retainer paid directly from the trust's primary operating account to defend the integrity of the assets. I did not have to scrape together pennies from my archiving jobs to fight them. I had the financial backing of a multi-million-dollar empire. Within 2 hours, Connor had secured us an emergency consultation with Naomi Grant. She was widely known as the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. She did not work for a flashy glass-walled firm like Jamal. Her office was located in a stark, brutalist building that looked more like a fortress than a legal practice. When we walked into her office later that afternoon, she was sitting behind a massive slab of reclaimed wood, reading through a legal brief. She did not wear a perfectly tailored suit or offer us espresso. She wore a simple black turtleneck and had the cold, calculating gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. I sat down and slid the crumbling leather passbook across her desk along with the stack of documents Mr. Harrison had printed. I briefly explained the wedding, the forced waiver Jamal tried to make me sign, and the smear campaign Stephanie was currently running on social media. Naomi did not interrupt me once. She picked up the passbook, examined the dry, rotted leather, and then started flipping through the bank records. Her eyes scanned the numbers with terrifying speed. After 10 minutes of total silence, she closed the folder and folded her hands over it. "Your brother-in-law is a sloppy, arrogant fool," Naomi said, her voice raspy and devoid of any polite warmth. "He thinks he is the smartest guy in the room because he bullies small business owners and intimidates family members. But he just handed you the absolute perfect legal trap." She tapped a long finger against the corporate charter. "By bringing you into his office and attempting to force you to sign a waiver surrendering this specific ledger, Jamal legally acknowledged your ownership of the trust. He validated your status as the majority shareholder on the record, and because he tried to execute the transfer under duress, he committed textbook extortion. But that is just the tip of the iceberg." Naomi slid a contract across the desk toward me. "It was a representation agreement. I am taking this case," she declared, "and I am billing my premium rate directly to your father's corporate accounts. We are going to bleed his legal defense fund dry using his own money." I signed the paper without a single second of hesitation. Connor squeezed my hand under the table, a fierce, proud smile on his face. The real explosion happened 2 days later. It was Thursday morning, and the financial freeze Mr. Harrison initiated had been active for 48 hours. Richard and Jamal were entirely locked out of their empire, desperate and scrambling in the dark. Connor and I were sitting in Naomi's fortress-like conference room when a secure courier arrived carrying 3 heavy cardboard banker's boxes. It was the complete forensic audit we had requested from the private bank. Mr. Harrison had pulled a team of senior accountants to work around the clock, tracking every single penny that had moved through the blind trust over the last 5 years. Naomi opened the first box and started spreading dense spreadsheets and banking ledgers across the long table. She handed Connor a red marker and handed me a yellow highlighter, assigning us specific columns to verify. For the next 3 hours, we sat in silence, tracing the flow of my father's supposed wealth. What we found was not just bad business management, it was a massive, meticulously orchestrated crime. Richard had been running his real estate firm into the ground for years. His luxury beachfront developments were completely stalled due to zoning violations and massive budget overruns. The company was actively hemorrhaging cash. To maintain his image as a brilliant billionaire patriarch and to keep funding Stephanie's extravagant lifestyle, Richard needed liquid capital. But because the blind trust required the physical passbook to authorize large-scale asset liquidation, he could not legally touch the principal funds. So he turned to Jamal. And Jamal used his position as a high-powered corporate attorney to systematically rob the trust blind. "Look at this," Naomi said, her voice practically vibrating with professional thrill. She pointed a pen at a series of massive wire transfers. Jamal set up a network of invisible shell companies disguised as independent consulting firms and raw material vendors. He was billing the real estate company millions of dollars for phantom construction supplies and fake legal consultations. Richard was approving the invoices, routing the trust's operating capital directly into these shell companies. I stared at the staggering numbers printed on the paper. The brand new Porsche he had given Stephanie at my wedding was not bought with his pocket change. It was purchased using stolen corporate funds laundered through a fake concrete supplier in Nevada. The down payment for their Aspen vacation home was wired from a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. They were living like royalty, entirely on stolen money. But then Naomi pulled a specific corporate registry document from the bottom of the box and laid it flat in the center of the table. Her cold predator eyes gleamed. "This is the part where your brother-in-law proves exactly how utterly heartless he really is," Naomi said, tapping the paper. "When you set up offshore shell companies to launder embezzled money, you have to list a primary beneficiary, a fall guy, someone whose social security number is attached to the accounts in case the Internal Revenue Service ever decides to look too closely. Jamal is a lawyer. He knows the risks. So he did not put his own name on a single one of these illegal accounts. I looked down at the highlighted section of the document. My breath hitched in my throat. The primary registered beneficiary for every single fraudulent shell company was Stephanie. Jamal had used his own wife as his primary legal shield. Stephanie was completely obsessed with her public image and her luxury lifestyle. She likely signed whatever towering stack of documents Jamal put in front of her, believing his lies about routine corporate restructuring. She thought her husband was a financial genius, providing her with an endless stream of wealth. She had absolutely no idea that he had framed her for international tax evasion. If the federal government ever uncovered this network, Stephanie would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary, while Jamal walked away clean, claiming attorney-client privilege. "He set her up," I whispered, staring at my sister's name printed over and over again on the illegal bank charters. My father handed her a Porsche, and Jamal handed her a prison sentence, and she has spent the last 2 days crying on the internet, calling me a thief. "She is a pawn," Naomi corrected sharply, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. "A very loud, very foolish pawn. But we are not playing a local family dispute anymore, Natalie." Naomi leaned back in her chair looking at the spreadsheet, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "This is not just civil litigation anymore. Embezzling from a corporate trust, crossing state lines, moving capital to offshore accounts. This is federal wire fraud. This is racketeering. The moment I hand these boxes over to the authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be knocking down your father's door." I felt a massive rush of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. For my entire life, Richard had acted untouchable. He had mocked my career, telling everyone I dug through useless papers. But it was exactly those archiving skills, my ability to read the fine print and trace the history of a document, that was about to bring his entire fraudulent empire crashing to the ground. Before I could tell Naomi to make the call to the federal authorities, her office phone rang. It was a sharp, piercing ring that cut through the heavy tension in the room. Naomi picked up the receiver, holding it to her ear. Her expression instantly shifted from triumphant satisfaction to cold, hard urgency. She listened for exactly 5 seconds before slamming the phone back onto the receiver. She stood up so quickly, her heavy chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "That was the private investigator I hired to monitor your father," Naomi said, grabbing her briefcase and shoving the most critical audit files inside. "The bank freeze finally broke him. Richard cannot access a single dollar to pay his contractors or his lawyers. He knows the walls are closing in, and he is making a desperate move right now." I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Where is he?" I asked. "He is at the assisted living facility," Naomi replied, tossing me my canvas tote bag. "He showed up with a private ambulance and 2 crooked doctors. He is trying to physically force your grandmother out of the building to execute the forged medical power of attorney. We have to go now." Connor drove my modest sedan like it was a getaway vehicle. He wove through the heavy afternoon city traffic with intense, focused precision, while Naomi sat in the passenger seat, turning the car into a mobile war room. She had her laptop open on her knees and her cell phone pressed tightly to her ear. Naomi was not just calling any judge. She was calling a federal district judge she had gone to law school with. She rapidly outlined the massive scale of the wire fraud, the offshore accounts, and my father's immediate physical threat to a vulnerable elderly woman. By the time Connor violently swerved the car onto the quiet suburban street where the assisted living facility was located, Naomi had secured a verbal emergency injunction, and a digital mandate was already sitting in her email inbox. "Pull up right to the front doors," Naomi ordered, pointing at the expansive manicured lawn of the luxury facility. "Do not bother parking." As we tore up the circular driveway, I saw exactly what Naomi had been warned about. A private, unmarked ambulance was idling aggressively at the curb directly in front of the main entrance. Its rear doors were wide open. Standing next to the ambulance were 2 burly men in dark blue scrubs who looked more like nightclub bouncers than medical professionals. My father was not planning a gentle medical transfer. He was planning an absolute extraction. Connor slammed the car into park before we had even fully stopped. We leaped out of the vehicle, leaving the doors open. As we sprinted toward the entrance, two massive SUVs aggressively pulled into the driveway right behind us. Four huge men wearing tactical gear and earpieces jumped out. They were the elite private security team Naomi had mobilized using the unlimited trust retainer. They fell into step seamlessly right behind us, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle as we stormed through the automatic sliding glass doors of the facility. The main lobby was in a state of absolute chaos. The elegant, quiet atmosphere of the upscale retirement home had been completely shattered. My father was standing near the front reception desk, his face an alarming shade of mottled red. He was screaming at the top of his lungs at the facility director, a small, terrified-looking woman who was clutching a clipboard to her chest. Standing right next to my father was a sleazy-looking man in a cheap, oversized suit, holding a worn leather medical bag. This had to be the crooked doctor Jamal had hired to rubber stamp the fraudulent competency evaluation. And then I saw her. Grandma Beatrice was sitting in her wheelchair parked tightly behind the reception desk. Two young nurses were standing protectively in front of her, physically blocking the path. My grandmother did not look confused or frightened. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching her son completely unravel with a look of profound, absolute disappointment. "I do not care what your internal policy is," Richard roared, slamming his heavy fist down on the polished wood of the reception desk. "I have the medical power of attorney. I have a licensed physician right here stating that she is in immediate danger to herself. You are illegally detaining my mother. If you do not let my transport team take her right this second, I will personally sue this facility into bankruptcy. I will buy this building and I will fire every single one of you." The director stammered, trying to explain that she needed legal verification, but Richard simply shoved past her. He gestured aggressively to the two burly men waiting near the doors. "Grab the wheelchair," he barked. "We are leaving." The two men stepped forward to push the nurses aside. I did not even have to say a word. Connor and the four private security guards surged past me with terrifying speed. They hit the center of the lobby like a freight train, physically intercepting the transport men. One of the security guards shoved the largest attendant backwards so hard the man stumbled and crashed into a decorative potted palm. The second guard stepped directly in front of my father, crossing his massive arms over his tactical vest, blocking his path to the reception desk entirely. Richard stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. He looked frantically at the heavily armed guards, and then his gaze snapped to the entrance. He saw me walking slowly into the lobby, with Naomi right by my side. "Natalie," Richard spat, his voice dripping with pure venom. "What the hell do you think you are doing? Call off these rent-a-cops right now. This is family business. You have absolutely no right to be here." "I have every right to be here," I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing clearly across the sudden silence of the lobby. I walked right past him, stepping behind the heavy wall of my security team, until I was standing directly next to Grandma Beatrice's wheelchair. I placed my hand gently on her frail shoulder. She reached up and patted my hand, giving me that same microscopic nod she had given me at my ruined wedding. "You are kidnapping her," Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You manipulated a sick old woman into handing over a bank book, and now you think you can play the boss. I am her son. I am the legal guardian." Naomi stepped forward, pulling a freshly printed document from her leather briefcase. "Actually, Richard, you are nothing," she said, her raspy voice cutting through his hysterics like a surgical blade. "Your fraudulent medical proxy was voided exactly 10 minutes ago by a federal district judge." She held up the paper, which bore a massive official red stamp. "Furthermore, this is a court-ordered emergency injunction," she continued loudly, ensuring every staff member in the lobby could hear her. "It legally bars you, Jamal and Stephanie, from coming within 500 feet of Beatrice. It also explicitly prevents you from accessing any medical or financial records pertaining to her care. If you take one more step toward this desk, you will be arrested for violating a federal order. The crooked doctor standing next to my father suddenly went completely pale. He looked at the court injunction, looked at Naomi's terrifying predatory glare, and immediately backed away. He turned around without saying a single word, clutching his leather medical bag, and practically sprinted out the sliding glass doors, abandoning my father entirely. Richard was completely cornered. His bank accounts were frozen. His lawyer's scheme was exposed. His hired doctor had just fled the scene. His entire reality was collapsing in real time in front of an audience of nurses and security guards. The illusion of the untouchable billionaire patriarch was completely shattered, leaving only a desperate, pathetic bully. He lost the last shred of his fabricated composure. He lunged forward, trying to bypass the security guard. The guard simply planted his hand firmly on Richard's chest and shoved him backward with effortless, brutal force. Richard stumbled and fell hard onto the polished tile floor, his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket bunching up awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked up at me from the ground, his face twisted in a mask of absolute feral rage. Spittle flew from his lips as he screamed at the top of his lungs. "You are a nobody!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperate fury. "I built this family. I built an empire from nothing. You are a pathetic little paper pusher. You are nothing without my money. You hear me? You are nothing." The wail of approaching police sirens began to echo loudly down the suburban street outside. Naomi had called the local precinct the moment we pulled into the driveway. Flashing red and blue lights reflected wildly against the glass doors of the lobby. I walked around the reception desk. I did not hide behind the security guards. I walked right up to where my father was scrambling to his feet. I stood perfectly straight, looking down into the eyes of the man who had spent 35 years trying to make me feel small. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt no guilt. I felt only the immense weight of the truth. I stepped right into his face, holding up the freshly stamped court injunction, so close he was forced to read the heavy black text. "No, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper that only he could hear. "You just spent Grandma's money. And now the tab is due." The automatic doors slid open and 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the lobby. Naomi immediately handed the lead officer the court injunction and pointed directly at Richard. My father did not go quietly. As the officers grabbed his arms and forcefully locked his wrists into heavy metal handcuffs, he thrashed and screamed, cursing my name and threatening to destroy me. He demanded they call the mayor. He demanded they call his lawyers. But no one listened. I stood quietly next to Connor, holding my grandmother's hand as we watched the police physically drag Richard out of the building. The great billionaire patriarch was shoved into the back of a black and white patrol car, his empire reduced to a pair of tight metal cuffs and a frozen bank account. My father did not spend the night in a jail cell. Men with his level of wealth rarely do, even when their empires are actively crumbling around them. Late Thursday evening, Jamal managed to leverage the last of his untouched legal connections to post a massive cash bail securing Richard's release pending formal federal indictment. But Richard knew he was operating on borrowed time. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was already combing through the banker boxes Naomi had handed over. The temporary bank freeze was going to become a permanent federal seizure within days. My father was desperate, like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door was about to slam shut permanently. He had exactly one move left to save his fortune, and he executed it before the sun even came up on Friday morning. He and Jamal called an emergency board of directors meeting at the real estate corporate headquarters. Their plan was highly illegal but brutally effective if they could pull it off. They intended to push through a hostile corporate restructuring, a massive dilution of the foundational trust shares. If they could get the board to vote in favor of creating millions of new phantom shares, they could water down the 51% controlling interest held by the bearer passbook. It was a scorched earth tactic designed to legally bypass my authority before I could officially process my ownership with the state. They scheduled the meeting for 9 a.m, assuming I would be too intimidated by the fallout of the arrest and the sheer scale of the corporate battlefield to show up. They thought the little archivist would stay hidden in her modest house, terrified of the legal threats Jamal had screamed at me just days prior. They were absolutely wrong. Friday morning, I did not wear my practical wool cardigan or my sensible walking flats. I walked into my bedroom closet and pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal designer suit I had purchased years ago for an international archiving symposium. Connor stood behind me in the mirror, gently adjusting the collar of my jacket. His eyes were filled with fierce, quiet pride. I took the crumbling leather passbook out of my canvas tote bag and placed it inside a sleek black leather briefcase Connor had given me for my birthday. I snapped the gold latches shut. I was not walking into that building as a bullied daughter. I was walking in as the majority shareholder. Naomi met us in the lobby of the massive glass and steel skyscraper that served as the crown jewel of Richard's real estate empire. She was wearing her signature black turtleneck, carrying a thick briefcase full of federal audit copies. She looked at my tailored suit, gave a single approving nod, and pressed the button for the private executive elevator. We rode up to the penthouse floor in complete silence, the sheer gravity of what we were about to do hanging heavily in the air. When the elevator doors parted, we stepped out into a sprawling reception area decorated with imported Italian marble and abstract sculptures. The receptionist stood up abruptly, opening her mouth to ask for our appointments, but Naomi simply flashed a terrifying, predatory glare that kept the woman completely frozen in her tracks. We walked past the reception desk, down a long corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. At the very end of the hall stood the entrance to the main boardroom. The doors were massive slabs of solid mahogany framed by thick acoustic glass walls. The blinds on the glass walls were partially drawn, but one of the heavy mahogany doors had been left open just a crack, likely by an assistant rushing to grab coffee. That tiny gap was all we needed. Naomi held up her hand, signaling us to stop just outside the entrance. We stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway, listening to the sound of Jamal's voice echoing out from the boardroom. The room was packed. I could see the shadows of at least 50 wealthy, arrogant investors and corporate directors sitting around a massive custom-built conference table. These were the men who had been making millions of dollars off my grandmother's blind trust for decades, completely ignoring the illegal methods my father used to generate their dividends. Jamal was standing at the head of the table mid-presentation. He sounded incredibly smooth, projecting the perfect aura of a confident corporate savior, but I could hear the faint underlying tremor of panic in his breath. He was pacing back and forth, clicking through a digital slideshow displaying complex restructuring graphs. "Gentlemen." Jamal projected his voice bouncing off the acoustic paneling. "I know the sudden freeze on our operating accounts has caused some understandable concern this week, but let me assure you, this is merely a temporary defensive measure. We are currently dealing with a highly sensitive internal family dispute." He paused, letting out a practiced, sympathetic sigh. "As many of you know, Richard's mother Beatrice has been suffering from severe cognitive decline. Unfortunately, a disgruntled family member has attempted to exploit this tragedy. Richard's oldest daughter Natalie has somehow managed to intercept some outdated legacy banking documents and is actively trying to hijack the corporate structure out of sheer financial ignorance." A murmur of annoyance rippled through the boardroom. Wealthy men hated nothing more than having their money interrupted by family drama. "I assure you," Jamal continued, raising his hands to calm the room, "we are handling it. Natalie is an estate archivist, gentleman. She spends her days dusting off old library books and organizing family photo albums. She has absolutely zero comprehension of high-level corporate finance. She is completely terrified of the legal ramifications of her little stunt, which is exactly why she did not even have the courage to show up to this building today." I stood in the hallway, clutching the handle of my leather briefcase, my face completely devoid of emotion. Connor stepped up right beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine, a silent pillar of absolute support. Inside the room, Richard was sitting off to the side, sweating profusely through his expensive shirt, dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. "So to protect your investments and to secure the future of this firm," Jamal announced, his voice rising to a commanding crescendo, We are executing an emergency dilution of the foundational trust shares. This will completely isolate the compromised legacy accounts and restore total financial control to Richard where it belongs. I need a formal show of hands right now to initiate the hostile restructuring and bypass the frozen ledger. The room grew quiet. Chairs squeaked as the wealthy investors prepared to raise their hands and vote away my grandmother's entire legacy to save their own pockets. Jamal stood at the head of the table, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face as he looked out at his captive audience. Naomi looked at me, raising one eyebrow. I did not say a word. I simply stepped forward and shoved both of my hands flat against the heavy mahogany doors. Just as Jamal asked for the vote, the massive doors swung wide open, crashing loudly against the interior walls of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors rebounded slightly after hitting the walls, the sound reverberating through the acoustic paneling of the massive boardroom. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Jamal froze mid-sentence, his hand still hovering over the digital slide clicker. The smug, victorious smile completely melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sudden, absolute horror. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the room. I was not the quiet estate archivist they were used to ignoring. I was not the budget bride they had publicly humiliated on a dance floor just days ago. I was wearing the sharply tailored charcoal designer suit, my posture perfectly straight, my heels clicking with deliberate rhythmic authority against the polished hardwood floor. I was not alone. Naomi walked slightly to my right, her black turtleneck and predatory glare radiating pure legal violence. She looked like a shark entering a pool of wounded fish. Behind us walked two men in dark conservative suits, carrying heavy locked briefcases. They were not private security. They were senior forensic auditors from the Federal Financial Regulatory Agency, handpicked by Naomi to oversee the transition of assets and document every single word spoken in this room. The sheer collective shock in the room was palpable. 50 of the wealthiest investors and corporate directors in the city sat completely paralyzed, staring at me as if an apparition had just interrupted their morning coffee. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the steady clicking of my heels. Then the spell finally broke. Richard leaped out of his leather executive chair, knocking it backward. His face, already flushed with the anxiety of his impending federal indictment, turned a dangerous, alarming shade of purple. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice cracking violently under the strain of his panic. "Security. Where is building security? Get this woman out of my boardroom immediately. She is trespassing. She has absolutely no authorization to be in this building." He looked frantically toward the glass walls, expecting armed guards to rush in and drag me away just like he had always dragged me down. He expected the world to bend to his volume because it always had. But no one came. Naomi had already handed the federal court injunction to the head of building security downstairs. They knew exactly who held the real power today, and it was no longer the desperate man screaming at the head of the table. The security team was standing down, waiting for my orders. Jamal tried to step in, desperately attempting to salvage his crumbling presentation and save face in front of the massive investors. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and projected his best courtroom voice, puffing out his chest. "Natalie, this is a closed corporate meeting," Jamal said, trying to sound legally authoritative, but completely failing to hide the slight tremor in his hands. "You are violating basic corporate governance. Leave right now before I have you formally charged with corporate espionage and trespassing. We are in the middle of a highly sensitive shareholder vote, and you are interrupting official business." I did not flinch. I did not stop walking. I completely ignored the empty guest chairs lined up neatly against the back wall, the chairs meant for minor employees, administrative staff, and people who had no real voice in this company. I walked the entire length of the massive custom-built mahogany table. I felt the eyes of every single investor tracking my movements. These were men who respected nothing but absolute power, and right now Richard and Jamal were bleeding power all over the floor. The investors could smell the blood in the water. They shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, watching the untouchable billionaire patriarch unravel before their eyes. I reached the head of the table. Richard was breathing heavily, gripping the edge of the polished wood so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack. Jamal stood paralyzed beside him, the digital slide clicker forgotten in his hand, the complex restructuring graphs still glowing brightly on the projector screen behind them. They had built this entire meeting, this entire fraudulent vote on the assumption that I was weak. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. "You do not have the authority to call a shareholder vote," Jamal Naomi said, stepping up right beside me and placing her hands flat on the table. Her raspy voice carried effortlessly to the very back of the silent room, cutting through the tension like a physical blade. "In fact, you do not have the authority to authorize a coffee run for this office. The corporate restructuring you are attempting to push through this morning is a direct violation of an active federal asset freeze. The two men standing behind me are federal auditors. They are here to ensure that not a single fractional share of this company is diluted, moved, or altered in any way." Naomi leaned forward, her eyes locking onto the wealthy investors seated around the table. "Any man in this room who raises his hand to vote for your fraudulent proposal will be actively participating in federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. I will personally see to it that your individual assets are frozen before you can even make it down to the parking garage." A collective gasp rippled through the seated investors. Several men immediately pulled their hands down from the table, physically distancing themselves from Jamal and Richard, as if the two men had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. I did not look at the investors. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father. He looked incredibly old in that moment, the arrogant billionaire facade completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, desperate man who had finally run out of lies. I set my sleek black leather briefcase down right in the center of his presentation space, pushing his scattered legal papers aside. I flicked the twin gold latches. They popped open with a sharp synchronized snap that echoed clearly in the dead silent room. I reached inside and pulled out the old, cracked leather passbook. I held it up for a fraction of a second, letting Richard see the brittle, decaying cover of the very thing he had mocked at my wedding reception. Then, with a smooth, forceful motion, I slammed the passbook down onto the polished mahogany table. The sound echoed through the massive boardroom like a gunshot. The echo of the passbook hitting the mahogany table faded into a thick, suffocating silence. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the dry, rotting leather, feeling the decades of history and power resting beneath my palm. Every single investor in the room stared at the small, brittle book. They were men who dealt in digital transfers and modern corporate law, but they were all old enough to recognize a bearer bond ledger when they saw one. They knew exactly what it meant. The physical embodiment of absolute control was sitting right in front of them, and it was not in my father's hands. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Natalie Brooks," I said, my voice steady and projecting clearly across the massive room. "I am Richard's oldest daughter, and contrary to the amusing fictional story my brother-in-law was just telling you, I am not terrified of this room. I am here to correct a massive critical failure in your corporate governance." Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. He slammed his hands onto the table, pushing himself up. "This is a complete outrage," he shouted, his voice echoing frantically. "I am the founder of this company. I am the chief executive officer. Do not listen to a single word she says. She stole that book from my mother. It is highly contested property, and it holds absolutely no legal weight in this boardroom." Naomi stepped forward smoothly, opening her sleek briefcase. She pulled out a thick stack of certified bank authentications bearing the official raised seal of the downtown private bank. "Actually, Richard, it holds the only legal weight in this boardroom," she corrected, handing the documents to the nearest investor who immediately began reading them. The senior branch manager of the Foundational Trust executed a formal verification of ownership at 10 o'clock this morning. Natalie is the legally registered and sole recognized holder of the bearer ledger. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthiest, most influential men sitting at the table. "Gentlemen," I said, raising my voice to cut through the rising murmurs. "As the verified holder of the Foundational Blind Trust, I hold 51% of the voting shares. I do not need your approval to restructure this company. I do not need a board vote to validate my authority. I am the majority shareholder." The murmurs instantly escalated into a chaotic roar. Men in expensive suits began arguing with each other, pointing at Jamal and demanding an explanation. I did not shrink back. I stood perfectly tall, letting the reality of my absolute ownership wash over the room. I raised my hand, and the sheer authority of the gesture brought the room back down to a tense, nervous quiet. "And my first act as chairwoman," I announced, looking dead into my father's panicked eyes, "is firing the chief executive officer effective immediately. Richard, you are terminated from all corporate entities, subsidiaries, and holdings attached to this trust." Richard staggered backward, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had publicly humiliated me at my own wedding, who had bragged about funding my life with his pocket change, was entirely speechless. His empire had just been legally ripped from his hands by the daughter he had spent 35 years calling a worthless disappointment. "You cannot do this to me," Richard finally gasped, clutching his chest, his face pale and sweating profusely. "You are destroying the company. You are destroying your own family. These investors will pull out every single cent of their capital, and you will be left with absolutely nothing." "I am not destroying the company, Richard," I replied coldly. "I am saving whatever is left of it after you and Jamal bled it dry." I gestured to the two federal auditors standing quietly behind me. They stepped forward, placing their heavy, locked briefcases onto the mahogany table. They popped the locks in perfect unison and opened the lids. Inside were dozens of thick black folders, each one containing the explosive results of the forensic audit Mr. Harrison had orchestrated. The auditors began walking around the massive table, handing a black folder to every single investor and board member present. Jamal realized exactly what was happening. The smooth, confident corporate attorney facade completely vanished. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab the folders away from the auditors. But Connor stepped squarely into his path, blocking him with his broad shoulders. Jamal bounced off Connor's chest and stumbled backward, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking very unkempt. "You all thought you were sitting here this morning voting to dilute my shares to save your quarterly dividends," I told the board, watching them open the black folders. "You thought you were protecting your investments from a disgruntled daughter. But what you were actually about to do was vote yourselves into a massive federal conspiracy." The silence in the room was entirely replaced by the heavy sound of thick paper pages turning. The investors began scanning the spreadsheets, the banking ledgers, and the offshore wire transfers. I watched their expressions shift in real time. The initial shock morphed into confusion and then rapidly hardened into pure, wealthy, predatory rage. These men did not care about family drama. They cared about their money. And the black folders proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my father and my brother-in-law had been stealing their money for years. "Look at page 4, Naomi instructed, her raspy voice commanding the room. "You will see the complete depletion of the Commercial Development Fund. Richard has not secured a new zoning permit in 3 years. The beachfront project he has been selling you on is completely bankrupt. He has been taking your investment capital and funneling it directly through fake construction suppliers to fund his own private lifestyle. One of the oldest investors, a man who had backed my father's firm for 2 decades, slammed his fist onto the table. The coffee cups rattled. "Richard, you son of a bitch!" the man bellowed, his face red with fury. "You told us the supply chain was backed up. You told us the permits were stalled in City Hall. You have been laundering our capital into dummy corporations in Nevada. And it gets worse. Naomi continued, relentlessly pointing toward Jamal. Turn to page 9, gentlemen. You will see exactly who set up those dummy corporations. Your brilliant corporate counsel, Jamal, orchestrated a highly sophisticated network of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide the embezzled funds and avoid federal taxes. And because he is a coward, he registered every single one of those illegal shell companies under the name of his own wife. The boardroom erupted. The investors were completely furious, shouting obscenities at Richard and demanding their money back. Several men pulled out their cell phones, immediately calling their own private legal teams to prepare massive civil lawsuits. The men who had been perfectly willing to vote away my grandmother's legacy just 10 minutes ago were now ready to tear my father apart with their bare hands. Jamal was completely panicking. He was hyperventilating, sweat dripping down his forehead, ruining his perfectly polished image. He saw his entire life, his prestigious law license, his freedom, his wealth evaporating right in front of his eyes. He desperately tried to salvage the situation, falling back on the only weapon he had left. "Stop reading those documents!" Jamal screamed, waving his arms frantically in the air, trying to speak over the roaring crowd of furious investors. "Close those folders right now. As the primary corporate counsel for this firm, I am formally invoking attorney-client privilege." He pointed a shaking finger at me and Naomi. "These documents were illegally obtained. They are highly confidential internal communications. Anyone who reads them or retains a copy of them is legally liable for corporate espionage. You cannot use these files against us. Hand them back, right now." He actually tried to snatch a black folder out of the hands of the furious investor sitting closest to him. The investor shoved Jamal's hand away with violent disgust, cursing at him. Naomi did not yell. She did not have to. She simply walked around the table, her sensible heels clicking sharply against the floor, until she was standing right in front of Jamal. She leaned in close, invading his personal space, staring at him with her cold, predatory eyes. The sheer intensity of her presence caused the surrounding investors to quiet down, eager to hear the final blow. "Jamal," Naomi whispered, her raspy voice echoing perfectly in the sudden hush of the room. "You are a partner at a top-tier firm. You should really know basic legal statutes by now." She tilted her head, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Attorney-client privilege does not apply when the attorney is an active co-conspirator in the crime. The crime-fraud exception voids your privilege entirely." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He just stared at her, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Furthermore, Naomi continued, tapping her manicured finger against his chest. "You cannot invoke privilege to protect evidence that is already in federal custody. The Federal Bureau of Investigation received these exact files an hour ago. The collapse of an empire does not happen in slow motion. Once the foundational pillar is kicked out, everything comes crashing down with terrifying speed." The investors in the boardroom did not even wait for the federal authorities to arrive before they turned on my father completely. The same men who had happily drank his expensive scotch and laughed at his arrogant jokes just a week prior were the ones who personally called building security. Two massive security guards walked into the boardroom, their faces totally devoid of sympathy. They stood over Richard and handed him a standard cheap cardboard banker box. They told him he had exactly 10 minutes to clear his personal belongings from the executive office, and if he resisted, they would forcibly remove him from the premises. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows with Connor and Naomi, watching the great patriarch of our family pack his things. Richard did not shout anymore. All the fight had completely drained out of him. He tossed a few framed photographs and a customized gold pen set into the cardboard box. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped a glass paperweight, shattering it across the carpet. When he finally picked up the box and walked toward the elevator, he looked small, frail, and utterly defeated. The security guards escorted him through the bustling main lobby during the peak of the morning rush hour. Dozens of employees, the very people he had terrorized and underpaid for decades, stopped what they were doing to watch him take his walk of shame. He kept his head down, staring at the marble floor, carrying his life in a cardboard box, before being shoved out into the busy city street. Jamal did not fare any better. Naomi had been exceptionally thorough in her destruction of his career. While we were standing in the boardroom exposing his crimes, she had her legal assistant courier a full copy of the forensic audit directly to the senior managing partners at Jamal's prestigious downtown law firm. By the time Jamal managed to escape the furious investors and flee back to his own office building, his fate was already sealed. He swiped his security badge at the private garage entrance, and the light flashed a solid, unforgiving red. His access had been completely revoked. A senior partner was waiting for him in the ground floor lobby, accompanied by a representative from the State Bar Association. They did not even let him upstairs to collect his custom-tailored suits or his expensive espresso machine. They handed him a formal termination letter right there in front of the reception desk. They informed him that he was not just fired, but that the firm was actively cooperating with the federal investigation to distance themselves from his massive liability. Jamal went from being a high-powered corporate lawyer to an unemployed, disgraced criminal suspect in less than an hour. He was facing certain disbarment and federal racketeering charges that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. But the most poetic justice of the day belonged to Stephanie. While Richard and Jamal were watching their professional lives explode, Stephanie was completely oblivious to the chaos. She had decided to spend her Friday morning doing what she did best, which was spending money she did not earn. She was downtown at an ultra-exclusive high-end designer boutique, sipping complimentary champagne with three of her wealthy, superficial friends. She had just spent 2 hours picking out imported leather handbags and a new cashmere coat, completely secure in her delusion that she was untouchable. She walked up to the sleek glass register, her friends watching enviously, as the clerk rang up a total that easily exceeded $15,000. Stephanie smiled her perfectly practiced arrogant smile and casually handed over her heavy metal black card. The clerk swiped it through the machine. The terminal beeped loudly, flashing a declined message. The clerk frowned, apologizing, and swiped it a second time. Declined again. Stephanie let out a patronizing little laugh, claiming there must be a fraud alert on the account because she traveled so much. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out her backup platinum card, the one tied directly to the corporate trust accounts. The clerk swiped it. Declined. She tried a third card. Declined. The polite retail smile completely vanished from the clerk's face, replaced by a look of cold professional judgment. Stephanie's friends stopped whispering about the clothes and started whispering about her. The humiliation was absolute and immediate. Stephanie frantically tried to call Jamal, but his phone was already seized as evidence. She tried to call Richard, but he was wandering the streets with a cardboard box. Her cheeks burned bright red as she snatched her useless plastic cards off the counter, muttering something about a bank error. She turned and practically ran out of the boutique, leaving the thousands of dollars worth of merchandise behind, trying to escape the pitying stares of her social circle. She burst out through the glass doors of the boutique onto the sidewalk, desperate to just get into her car and speed away. But when she reached the valet stand, her nightmare reached its absolute peak. The valet attendant handed her a slip of paper instead of her keys. A flatbed tow truck was just pulling away from the curb, and strapped to the back of it was the brand new midnight blue Porsche Cayenne Richard had given her at my wedding. Because the car had been purchased using stolen corporate funds laundered through a shell company, the federal authorities had instantly flagged it as a seized asset. The bank had issued an immediate repossession order. Stephanie stood alone on the crowded city sidewalk, wearing her expensive silk dress, watching her luxury sports car disappear into the downtown traffic. She had no money, no car, and a husband who was about to be indicted by the federal government. Within 24 hours, the entire fabricated reality they had built on the back of my grandmother's stolen wealth was completely eradicated. The sprawling beachfront developments were seized by the bank to cover the embezzled funds. The Aspen vacation home went into immediate foreclosure. The golden child and the untouchable patriarch were left with absolutely nothing but the cold, hard reality of their own greed. It had been exactly 1 month since the boardroom doors slammed shut on my father's empire. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Connor and I were sitting on our front porch drinking coffee, enjoying the absolute peace that comes from excising a toxic tumor from your life. The silence of the neighborhood was suddenly broken by the sound of a failing engine. A rusted, faded silver sedan sputtered down our quiet suburban street and pulled awkwardly into our driveway. The muffler scraped loudly against the concrete. I watched in mild disbelief as the driver's side door groaned open. It was Richard. He was not wearing a custom-tailored suit or a silk tie. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and cheap slacks that looked like they had been slept in. A moment later, the passenger door opened and Stephanie stepped out. The designer sunglasses and cashmere sweaters were gone. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, her face pale and completely devoid of her usual expensive makeup. They walked slowly up the front walkway. The arrogant swagger that had defined my father for 35 years was completely erased. They looked like two desperate strangers. Connor stood up, placing himself slightly in front of me, but I gently touched his arm and stepped forward to meet them at the edge of the porch. They stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps looking up at me. Stephanie immediately burst into tears, but this time there were no strategic pauses or camera ring lights. It was the ugly, genuine crying of a woman who had never worked a day in her life and was suddenly facing total financial ruin. "Natalie, please." Stephanie sobbed, wrapping her arms around her own stomach. "You have to help me. Jamal's assets are completely frozen by the federal court. He is facing prison time, and the lawyers took everything I had left just to keep him out of federal holding. I am sleeping on a couch in a studio apartment. Please, Nat. You are my big sister. We are blood. Can you just authorize a small monthly allowance from the trust? Just enough for rent." I looked at the woman who had mocked my budget wedding, who had happily accepted a stolen luxury car while I scraped by. Then I looked at Richard. He could not even meet my eyes. He stared at the wooden floorboards of my porch, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Natalie," he muttered, his voice barely a dry, raspy whisper. "I made mistakes. I pushed too hard. But I am still your father. I fed you. I clothed you. We are family. You cannot just leave us out here with nothing. Family loyalty has to mean something." For my entire life, those words would have paralyzed me. They would have sent me spiraling into a pit of guilt and obligation. But as I stood there looking at them, I realized I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, distant pity. They did not miss me. They did not regret abusing me or stealing from my grandmother. They only regretted that they got caught. Family loyalty means everything. "Richard," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of emotion. "But you broke that loyalty the day you tried to lock your own mother in a psychiatric ward for a paycheck." I stepped back toward my heavy front door. Stephanie let out a loud wail, reaching her hand out toward the steps. "Please," she begged. "We have nothing left. It is completely worthless out here." I paused right at the threshold, looking back at them one last time. "You stood at my wedding and told everyone that Grandma's legacy was worthless," I replied, keeping my gaze locked dead on my father. "I am just taking your financial advice." I stepped inside, shut the heavy wooden front door right in their faces, and threw the deadbolt, locking it with a loud, satisfying click. I did not look out the window to watch them drive away. I simply walked back into the kitchen, where Connor was already pulling our suitcases from the hall closet. We had a flight to catch and a new life to build. My very first act as the legal majority shareholder of the real estate empire was not buying a mansion or a sports car. I hired Naomi to completely dismantle the corrupt corporate structure and liquidate the toxic assets. Then I took the remaining clean capital and established a secondary ironclad untouchable care trust, exclusively for Grandma Beatrice. I moved her out of that depressing state-run facility and transferred her into the most exclusive luxury private care estate in the state. She now has a private suite, a personal garden, and a dedicated team of nurses who treat her with absolute dignity and respect. I visit her every single Sunday, and her mind is sharper and brighter than it has been in years. She is safe, and no one will ever be able to use her again. With the company officially purged of Richard's toxic influence and placed under the management of a newly appointed ethical board of directors, the legitimate commercial properties actually began to turn a massive profit. The very first dividend check I received as chairwoman was more money than I had made in a decade of archiving. I did not use it to prove my worth to anyone. I used it to finally take the honeymoon Connor and I had dreamed of. Tomorrow morning, we are boarding a first-class flight to the Maldives for 2 weeks of uninterrupted peace, crystal clear water, and absolutely no family drama. I look back at the journey of the past year, the tears, the humiliation, and the terrifying moments standing in that private bank vault. It taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. I want to say this directly to every single person out there who is still carrying the heavy burden of a toxic family. Family is not defined by blood or by who paid for your childhood meals. Family is respect. And respect, unlike their money, is something you have to earn. You do not owe your abusers your loyalty, and you certainly do not owe them your future. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to finally find your true worth? Have you ever had to break the cycle and build your own empire from the ashes of their disrespect? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe in taking your power back. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your worth is entirely your own.